Welcome back to Holy Nerdvana. We're here again with Once Human, this time retesting everything in DirectX 11 mode at the same time of day within the game. This should level the playing field as much as possible. I know some people complained about the prior testing, so I've gone back to retest everything and ensure the results are more representative. No more DX12 on Nvidia versus DX11 on AMD shenanigans. To start, we've got the 4060 versus the 7600 XT. You can see the 4060 is generally outperforming the 7600 XT. That's not too unusual. The reason we're doing DirectX 11 is that DirectX 12 had problems running on AMD the last time we checked, so while DirectX 12 is required to get DLSS or XeSS support, we felt it was best to stick to just one graphics API, so it's all DirectX 11. We're also testing at the same time of day, generally within a minute or two in game time. What we've found is that the game is on a 24-hour cycle for each real-world hour, so a 24:1 ratio. At the start of every hour, it's midnight in the game, and at half past the hour, in the game it's high noon. We've been running some other benchmarks and figured we could just do our Once Human retesting at the same time, so every time we swap GPUs, at around half past we fire up Once Human to capture updated results. With the RX 7900 GRE versus RTX 4070, the 4070 lost pretty badly. We'll see that throughout our testing. RX 7900 XTX versus the 4080 Super, we again see AMD is effectively destroying Nvidia. This appears to be more of a case of driver optimizations, particularly at lower settings. DirectX 11 on AMD in this particular game runs quite well and seems to be better tuned than on Nvidia. The margins will decrease at higher quality settings and resolutions, so this is the worst case scenario for Nvidia, mostly because we're at 1080p middle or medium settings. We also tested the RTX 4090 and you can see that we're basically hitting CPU limitations. The RTX 4090 and the 4080 Super at 1080p middle are both delivering about the same level of performance, and that goes for the 7900 XTX and the GRE as well. AMD's GPUs both hit higher frame rates in Once Human in DirectX 11 mode at 1080p. Here are the overall standings for 1080p middle. The RX 7900 XTX and 7900 GRE are both at 230 to 240 frames per second, while the RTX 4080 Super, 4090, and 4070 are all hitting CPU bottlenecks and land in the 185 to 195 FPS range. The 4080 Super even beat the 4090, just barely, and the 4070 is just a little off that pace. So that's where the limit is for the Nvidia cards at 1080p middle settings. No upscaling, just native rendering. Let's bump up to 1080p with very high settings, the maximum level for this game, still without any upscaling. You can see the 7600 XT and the 4060 are delivering pretty comparable performance. The 4060 is just a hair faster overall, but not so much that you'd really notice a difference between these two GPUs at these settings. And it is the same time of day, though slight differences in the weather or video capture or something means the two halves don't always look exactly the same. Moving on to the RTX 4070 and the 7900 GRE, AMD's card still easily outpaces Nvidia's card, and that's not too unusual for a rasterization game like Once Human. The game uses Unreal Engine, but only using Unreal Engine 4, probably because Unreal Engine 5 tends to be more demanding. So there's a balancing act between visual fidelity and performance, and the developers here opted to make their free-to-play game run faster and work on a wider set of hardware by sticking with UE4. Next we have the RTX 4080 Super and the RX 7900 XTX. AMD's card often isn't faster, but in Once Human it's delivering slightly higher performance, at least in DirectX 11 mode at 1080p very high settings. Overall performance continues to favor AMD's card, perhaps because it has more memory bandwidth, though it also has a goodly amount of rasterization compute. And last we have the RTX 4090, the fastest GPU overall right now in most situations. It's definitely not going to be pushed to its limit at 1080p very high settings in this particular game, and it still comes in behind AMD's fastest GPU. This is more of a limitation of the 1080p resolution rather than the GPUs. On a related note, We've looked at power use and the 4090 is definitely not going all out right here. It can draw up to 450 watts normally, but at 1080p with very high settings in Once Human it's only using 207 watts. That tells you how much it's being held back by the CPU. Here's the overall chart, with 4080 Super beating the 4090 again. 1080p just isn't the strong suit for the 4090 in a lot of games, and you really want a top-shelf CPU to push the 4090. The 7900 XTX and GRE are basically tied as well, within 5 frames per second, so CPU limits are in play there, they're just hitting higher CPU limits on AMD's GPUs. And at the bottom, you've got the 4060 just coming in barely ahead of the 7600 XT, but with lower minimum FPS. Once we kick up to 1440p very high settings, that starts to remove the CPU from being the limiting factor on the fastest GPUs. On the 4060 and the 7600 XT it won't make a big difference, as these are relatively budget cards that cost around $300. 1440p is about as far as you'd want to push them, and they're both getting over 60 frames per second in general. There are areas of the game that will run slower than what we're showing, other areas will run faster, but they're both still very playable, and you can enable upscaling to get a performance boost, which is something we would suggest doing if you're after higher performance. And it doesn't compromise visual quality that much either, in our opinion, though FSR2 doesn't look quite as nice as DLSS. RX 7900 GRE and RTX 4070, it's still all AMD all the time in this particular game. These cards start at $520 to $540, depending on the day of the week. And the GRE has 16 GB of RAM, more memory bandwidth, and generally higher rasterization performance, so it's able to easily beat Nvidia's mid-range GPU. Most of the time, the only way you can change that is if you play a ray tracing game or enable DLSS but not FSR2 or 3. So if you don't care about ray tracing, and let's be honest it's often falling short of the hype, then the 7900 GRE remains an exceptionally capable card. RTX 4080 Super and RX 7900 XT get a little closer now, but the 7900 XT still holds the lead. And that was the case with the DirectX 12 on Nvidia versus DirectX 11 on AMD testing we did previously, but the gap has narrowed slightly with both GPUs running DirectX 11 mode. And they're getting well above 100 frames per second, with the 4080 Super getting close to 160 FPS on average, whereas the 7900 XT lands close to 190 FPS. That's about a 20% advantage to AMD. Finally we have the RTX 4090 versus the RX 7900 XTX. And even here, the 4090 still isn't able to run flat out, drawing around 275 watts according to our measurements. It does take a slight lead over the 4080 Super, but performance between the 4080 Super and the 4090 is really close until we get to 4K, which we'll get to next. But first let's go ahead and look at the charts for 1440p performance. Overall, AMD's RX 7900 XTX remains the fastest GPU at nearly 190 FPS. The 7900 GRE however is now much slower than the XTX, which makes more sense when you look at the two GPU specifications. RTX 4090 just barely edges out the 4080 Super, so CPU limits remain a factor. The 7900 GRE ends up around 25% faster than the 4070, which in turn leads the 4060 by over 50%. And at the bottom of the chart, the 4060 still edges past the 7600 XT that has twice as much VRAM, but minimum FPS is more stuttery on the 4060 card. Now let's push the GPUs to their breaking point with 4K native resolution and very high settings. That's maxed out settings, still with no upscaling. The RTX 4060 and 7600 XT both start to struggle, still averaging over 30 frames per second but with occasional dips into the mid to high 20s. The game remains playable but not super smooth. We'd definitely use upscaling of some form on these GPUs if you want to use 4K, meaning you'd need to have a 4K monitor. RTX 4070 and the RX 7900 GRE, AMD still continues to lead by a very decent margin, which again isn't surprising. Neither GPU consistently stays above 60 FPS, however, with AMD dipping into the low 50s while Nvidia's 4070 averages just 61 FPS and has lows in the 40s. So the AMD 7900 GRE does better at maintaining 60 FPS or above, but if that's what you're after, you still probably got to turn on upscaling to get there across all areas in the game. With the RTX 4080 Super and RX 7900 XTX, AMD continues to hold a pretty sizable lead. The 7900 XTX is averaging nearly 110 FPS compared to just under 100 FPS for the 4080 Super, but there's also a lot more dips on minimum FPS with Nvidia. You'll see that better in the chart with the 1% lows. Both remain totally playable, of course, but it's better to have minimums well above 60 rather than just at 63 FPS, which is what we measured for the 4080 Super. Shifting to the RTX 4090, Nvidia's fastest GPU finally manages to take the lead. That's expected if you're in a completely GPU-limited situation, which is what 4K native rendering at max settings tends to be. With Once Human, whether it's DirectX 11 or DirectX 12 with 4K rendering, the RTX 4090 ends up being the fastest card. It's not by as big of a margin as we see in some other games, but it's still about a 10% victory over the closest competitor. Checking out the overall chart, you can get nearly 120 FPS with the 4090, though minimums are worse in general on Nvidia GPUs again. The 7900 XTX lands just below 110 FPS, compared to just below 100 FPS on the 4080 Super. The RX 7900 GRE manages a solid 72 FPS, then 61 on the RTX 4070, both with minimums well below that mark. And wrapping things up, we have 39 and 36 frames per second on the two budget GPUs. So they're all technically playable, yes, but it would be better if you had upscaling. And because we're in DirectX 11 mode, we can't use DLSS or XeSS, which also means no frame generation with DLSS 3. There's certainly a balancing act when choosing between settings on Nvidia. Do you want DLSS plus frame gen, which can look smoother and performance can seem higher, even if the input sampling gets delayed and runs slower? It's not a panacea in other words, but it is an option if you have an Nvidia RTX 40 series card. And here the RTX 4060 still continues to outpace the 7600 XT, so the FSR2 upscaling isn't favoring AMD's GPUs. The same goes for the RTX 4070 and the RX 7900 GRE. AMD still comes out faster, and now both cards are easily clearing 60 FPS average, making this a great way to play the game if you have one of these GPUs. But do note that the minimums on the Nvidia card still dip more than on AMD. You'll also notice how the game is getting darker. We started testing at 2 PM game time with 1080p medium, and it takes about an hour for each setting. So these recordings are at around 3:30 PM for 1080p very high, 4:30 PM for 1440p, 5:30 for 4K, and 6:30 for the 4K with upscaling shown here. But each GPU does each setting at close to the same time, so we're keeping things as fair as possible. With the top-end GPUs, RTX 4080 Super and RX 7900 XT, AMD still leads, and both cards only got about a 13% boost from upscaling. Actually, it's 12% for the 7900 XTX and 14% for the 4080 Super, so Nvidia got a slightly bigger benefit in this particular instance from FSR2 upscaling. But either way, that's less than what we normally see. In many games we'll see closer to a 40% boost in frame rates from quality mode upscaling, but in Once Human it seems the complexity of upscaling almost matches the reduction in the number of pixels being fully rendered. The RTX 4090 also remains in the lead, but it received the same 12% boost from FSR2 as the XTX card. You could of course turn on DirectX 12 mode with DLSS and framegen, which we've shown previously, and that gives a bigger lead in the chart. However, we think this is a better view of what performance actually feels like in the game when using the best settings and would generally recommend sticking with DirectX 11 for Once Human, at least right now. The game sees almost daily patches, so maybe in a few months DX12 will be better. Maybe NetEase will add FSR3 upscaling and framegen support as well. But right now, overall the 4090 has about a 10% lead over the 7900 XTX, which is 10% ahead of the 4080 Super. Then there's a pretty big 35% gap between the 4080 Super and the 7900 GRE, which leads the 4070 by only 8% now. And the 4070 has a sizable 65% lead over the 4060, which beats the 7600 XT by 12%. So, VRAM capacity clearly isn't the major limiting factor in performance, as the 4060 consistently beats the 7600 XT. Best guess is that it's just drivers and engine optimizations. Maybe the developers focused more on DLSS 3 for Nvidia, targeting DX12 mode, but then for AMD the focus was DX11 for whatever reason. Which is still weird, because AMD often benefits more from low-level APIs like DX12, but we'll just chalk that up to Unreal Engine. We hope you've enjoyed this revised, updated, new and improved look at Once Human running in DirectX 11 mode. Our testing was conducted between October 10th and 12th, and there were still a couple of game patches that came out during that time span. So things can still change in the coming weeks and months. But this remains a popular game, with well over 50,000 concurrents every day, and we suspect it will continue to see plenty of updates. Thanks for watching, have a lovely day, and if you like this content please give us a thumbs up and a subscribe, and share this on your favorite social platforms. Until next time, ta-ta my loves.